The obstruction by the terrorists creates the act of the insurrection. And in these functions, you have the systemic enforcement of white supremacist communism, which substantively changes the form of the economy by the use of their crimes, which creates the liability for the insurrectionists to be compelled to pay, which they sought Confederate defenses against as a parasite enemy of the United States in insurrection to overthrow the authority. Their double agents have infiltrated the government, such as in the legislature, seeking the insurrection to overthrow the authority, barring them from the policies which protect the Confederate activities of their treason. That insurrection disqualifies them from the right to hold office immediately, without the function of going through the entire concepts of prosecution and the rest of the processing. The act of insurrection is the immediate disqualifier. The act of supporting the enforcement of the white supremacist communism is the crime. The right of the people to be protected by their crimes is essential to national security, and thus the overthrow of the authority by violence is the support by the policies fraudulently defending the hate crimes, which are by definition KKK contracts without service of law, which generates our obligation to engage in the defense of the United States systematically, such as their theory for Pokemon Go, which has the defenses for the original Scyther, and from their meta version of it, it would have its parry attacks against the physical and its parry attacks against the projectiles, which would require Pokemon Go to be a different game, substantively requiring them to add badges for additional powers and moves, whatever. But these kinds of concepts generated systemically protecting the function of the double team, increasing the disguise for the evasion so that it's harder to hit the actual substantive thing until the any attacks that are able to be actually got on for the double damage by attacking the double team would be parried by that function, as they would systemically be worn down as the Scyther would increase its damages as it loses health. And as it loses its energy, it would tap out to high grade defenders um, in some kind of gym battle type arrangement where it would recharge by lack of energy. But these types of counterattack functions from that theory has to systemically be applied inside the United States concerning the law, as it is essential to national security and law enforcement that order be sustained despite the terrorism, and thus it has to be high defense, high counter moves, um, punishments for having conducted attacks has to be the foundational concept for these arrangements. And in that restores and acknowledges the fact that Congress does not have authority to support the abridgment of the freedom of speech, which includes money, which includes the function of attacking the ability to sustain one's own human decency and status. And in the attack against contracts, such as the contracts with education, which builds contracts for work, for profit, you have the general public's right to sustain themselves, to be secure in their person, their papers, and their effects, which means they are not vulnerable to the government's subversion, such as the Confederates' War of Attrition, which systemically sabotages these fundamental rights, and the activity of having endorsed them, stating that there is no remedy to the Confederate activity in the defense of the invisible empire, generates the act of treason and insurrection as the violent overthrow of the authority. as the judges are obligated to give legal opinions about the law under the Constitution, starting with superior law and then its subordinate defining text as inferior law is below superior law, hence lower and higher. And thus, in this arrangement, their Confederate anarchical position to completely rebel against all competent law, reason, and stability has put inferior law above superior law in the rejection of this function so that there cannot be a challenge to their anarchical insurrection, as they degrade society back into historical damages against the general community, as they compel by their violence and threats the white supremacy into the only ability to engage in society, and thus the de facto law by terrorism for anarchy. And in that arrangement goes back to the 1950s, 1940s, 1920s racism against particular groups, which includes the blacks and the Jews and the rest of the historically abused. And the justification by this system to say that they could be targeted on the basis of race um, generates the ability to target them as enemy combatants by Lindsey Graham's insurrection, as his policies are treason and disqualify him from office, which state that anyone of military age or otherwise can be targeted for any reason, immediately dissolving all rights which were to be defended by the Constitution, which he has acted in systemic rebellion against to overthrow that authority in order to reform society back into his ideal white supremacist communism, which allows them to centrally plan the results of everything. And when you can centrally plan the results of everything, you can blame the defects in any society on the basis of their charismatic socialism or other defects planned by the terrorism, and then withholding the key pieces of information out of the court of records, you're able to express any of the delusional illusions with absolute confidence because you've defrauded the record as a matter of policy. And in that arrangement, anyone can be guilty of anything on the basis of simply having been targeted, similar to the Soviet Union having done this in the gulags, where they had done it to the position where anyone who was perfectly innocent, even their own guards who were targeted in the act of betrayal, can't fight it because they were targeted, and thus they have nothing to argue against in the recourse because there is no recourse because they were targeted, and thus they're guilty of being targeted, and thus there is no hope for them, and thus there is no remedy, and thus because there is no remedy, there is no ability to access the government in order to ask for a remedy because there is no remedy. And thus, you don't have the right to speak with the government or approach the courts in order to file all of the various claims and actions because the end result becomes impossible according to that arrangement in service of the communism. And in this, they have enforced white supremacy through anarchical terrorism or anarchical communism, which has guaranteed them their predetermined crimes in their spoils from their crimes to be sustained in their permanent account, allowing them to keep all of the resources from their thefts and other crimes as communists, especially white supremacist terrorists, trade people and not money, and thus are functionally incompetent when it comes to the transfer of resources such as money, as they become defective in the production of actually sustaining themselves in favor of compelling somebody else to do it. Since their hyperinvestment into artificial intelligence has been progressed, their creation of the Rocos Basculus generates the capacity for their white supremacist god to be created, which could then take care of them in their incompetence, and the superintelligence basculus being able to do this itty bitty small pieces of information means that they can go back to their bigoted texts, and their bigoted texts can sustain them with the superintelligence protecting them from their own stupidity. And in the United States, the Constitution says that you cannot change status without due process, and their attack on due process is fundamental to their insurrection. Thus, the act of their use of secret Confederate hate crimes from KKK contracts, from their surveillance systems, sabotages contracts, and the poisons and psyop harassments in messing with the enemy as they systematically undermine by secret government activities the normal function of society, such as the forming of the contract, violating the Constitution's position in the war of attrition, as they exhaust the general public's ability to generate profits by the contracts for the enforcement of the white supremacist communism, and in that arrangement compels the obligation of the Americans to restore national security and enforce the law against these criminal activities, at which point the terrorists are liable to pay for the values of the damages, including the function of the value of the contracts. And these terrorisms, such as the charismatic socialism, has used these fake secret experiments in order to sabotage the gathering of associations, such as the breach of the freedom of association to peacefully assemble, such as the right to make contracts in the free economy, which is no longer free because of the communism. And in the enforcement of the secret white supremacist communism by the invisible empire, generates the substantive changes to the economy, and thus what looks defective to the general public is simply the side effects of the war damages in their hot war against justice. And at that point, the act of referring to justice and the competent function of government is the enemy which they've engaged in treason against by the acts of war, such as their deals with the devil, which has led them to sell the United States in part and in whole to other nations which would consider themselves rivals and would generate themselves to the position of adversarial positions of war on maturity by the invention of the Confederates, who then would mature into material war in order to finish that sale, at which point the Confederates would exhaust the Americans in their entirety as the sale is complete, and then finish the war with the marked parties which has taken the sale, betraying the sale, which would then lead to the final wars with them and the marked nations. At which point the marked nations, being fully exhausted by their conflict with the Americans, similar to the proxy war in Ukraine in order to exhaust the Russians, would then collapse those other nations as they would take all of the benefits from their Jezebelian arrangements. And in the position of the narrative of Jezebel, the king wanted a vineyard, and the owner wouldn't give it to him because it is against the law for him to sell it, um, as it is fundamental to his family, and thus the permanent sale is prohibited. And thus he went crying to Jezebel, who then arranged for false men to lie about the owner of the vineyard so that they can do lawfare against it, similar to Lindsey Graham's insurrection, where they then can conduct the false arguments from the fraud, as the king has the capacity to defraud the courts by the use of those secrets. The only possible outcome is the false conviction of the vineyard owner, which then allows for the vineyard to be taken and sold and distributed back to the king, who would then ingest it on the basis of that fraud. And thus, Jezebel has served her king and her husband, um, which has systemically been reproduced in their Canaanite religion for the Confederacy, which substantively worships Jezebel, as the Confederates are um, fundamentally uh, conducting the state religion of the Canaanites for the worship of the Jezebel spirit, which generates their capacity to enforce their druid superiority as they corrupt and convert and overthrow the churches, um, seeking in that religion the mass ingestion of people into hell, which requires them to have crippled the Christians by overthrowing the church, which would then create an additional highway and byway into hell. At which point, the devil worshippers subcontract the deal with the devil to other participants, such as those in the cop forces, which would then make the deal taking over the charisma, uh, not the charisma, what was it? The karma, rather. Taking over the negative karma, or the spiritual sins or debts under that religion, which would then free the devil worshippers of the negative karma and would give them the collateral or the commission from the souls that went to hell because of them. At which point they're seeking the increase of their status by the service of hell, by the creation of these commissionable souls, making them more important according to that religion. At which point, this is fundamentally an attack on Christianity, which is paramount to their success in the destruction of the West, which they have contracted by the ingestion of other factions. Now, they have lost the direct conflict in the United States, requiring them to create other factions to ingest, as they've converted many groups, such as the black community, which has been targeted by their communism to be socially engineered by the white supremacists into the gimmick version of themselves so that they can then be blamed for their social defects, which are planned by the white supremacists. But then it's a matter of culture and not a matter of white supremacy. But the culture is a derivative of the white supremacy, generating the natural defects in this position as they are controlled to be collapsed so that they can easily be digested when they are betrayed, at which point they have betrayed their own community by supporting the white supremacists, which have perpetually harassed and abused them, requiring the remedy under the United States rule of law, which is actively something that the Confederates are allergic to, as the Confederates are a parasite which have created a poison to stop the immune system of law enforcement by the blocking of remedies to secrets or primary actions of the Confederate parasite feeding on the United States, which is killing the United States. And these additional factions, primarily the promotion of the communism, has a core interest of destroying the West, which it has done a stand-up, knockout job for. And in this, the continued destruction of the West includes their proxy war in Ukraine, at which point any solution that they provide that isn't David Bowles is going to functionally fail, as it was a predetermined crime with predetermined solutions which were not designed to succeed. They were designed to conduct a racket by systemic crimes in their RICO violations and various criminal schemes by their communism. Any answer that they will accept will fail on maturity according to their scripted plan. At which point, anyone who would actually solve those things, like the war in Ukraine, would have to force the duel, compel Congress to acknowledge David at the instructed time and the contract schedule, and demand the full restoration, as David Bowles is the only one capable and competent enough in the original value to perform those actions, at which point, with the Americans' national security back in power, the Confederates' actions can then be undone, which will allow legitimate negotiations with the Russians, which allows for a series of checkpoints in a peace process, starting with a ceasefire in good faith, which they would be able to verify, determining long-term peace and prosperity. In the words of Donald Trump, there is no reason for us to not like Russia. Russia should be someone that we are at peace with. There's no reason for us to not have a good relationship with them. And thus, making good deals with Putin is fundamental to this. And now, that paraphrase will have specific quotes, but I don't actively have access to it right now. But this allows us to produce the actual desired outcome everyone says that they want, but those in those strategic positions for the double agents have blocked the real solutions and guaranteed that any answer would fail. And thus you need to conduct these actions, including the acknowledgement of David according to the obstructed contract schedule, as they are his legal rights, in the restoration of that system, which will then embarrass Congress into performing their responsibilities, which will then force the duel, which will then guarantee the formal acknowledgement of the United States to defend the Constitution against its enemies, which will then use David in his original position as intelligence oversight to conduct the function of national security as its general, generating the pretense of his ability to negotiate with the Russians, as he would have in that action had conquered the function of the Confederates, allowing the good faith negotiations to be possible, as any negotiations that the Russians make without David will be conducted by the Confederates, who were responsible for it in the first place, who will only provide them plans in order to fail, such as their historic positions of previous ceasefires, which only served to give them additional time to rearm themselves, which allowed the reinforcements to engage in additional violence in those conflicts, as the negotiations are exclusively in bad faith when managed by the white supremacists, who are deeply racist against the Slavics, and thus the Russians would never receive a good faith agreement. And the Russians, having historically known this, understand that international law is functionally a joke, and that the position is exclusively that only the important nations of high status deserve the actual international laws and human rights and the rest of it, and anyone who is not of the correct positions or locations or nations or associations and networks, anyone who isn't part of the inside club functionally doesn't have it, such as the UN's renowned position of its rapes in Africa and other poor countries. Um, I forgot, I think it was Uganda and Morocco and many of the other countries in Africa had received complaints about UN rapists who were trading foreign aid resources for sex. And they had to get repairs, but the UN systemically protects their agents over any international law, which proves that it is substantively useless in those regards when it would actually be useful to a country that is functionally defenseless. So when the Confederates, who are enemies of the United Nations, starts to conduct their sabotage of the United States and its agents in order to subvert the European countries, it actively exploits this weakness in order to get that bias essentially connected to the destruction of their nations as the parasites collapse those countries, turning it into abject misery for everyone, as socialism is the equal enforcement of poverty, such as in the concept for the faceless lord of ooze, Jubilix from D&D, the collective consciousness from that identity of the acidic ooze to completely dissolve everything is derivative of that compelled anarchy, which breaks down all of the historical wealth created by those nations and their dealings. They are currently suffering a suicide pact, and the sons of perdition in that suicide pact have demanded the collapse of the stability and wealth and prosperity and legitimacy and sanity in favor of anarchy, in favor of the insurrectionists, in favor of lawless terrorism, to enforce their arbitrary spells where they exploit their society to create the communism for their predetermined centrally planned hierarchies promised by the Confederate Communists, which have no interest in satisfying those agreements, which will then betray them. As the plan systemically collapses them, they then will be subject to the Confederates, who will then do whatever they please. And if they generate their satanic rituals to mature one of their Antichrist ritual functions, one of their reserve Antichrist options will then materialize the solutions in Hegelian dialectic, which will then give false restoration to those nations under those deals, creating the massive damages and some restoration, as any peace is better than complete terror, and in that trade generate the exchange for the mass ingestion of the entire planet at its highest population, to convert them into guaranteed subjects of hell in service of their state religion loyal to Satan. Alternatively, you can support God and law and the United States, but this will require you to respect David Bull's rights and restore the original status which is owed by law, acknowledging all of these functions, which is the only solution that is possible to work. Law and order is the only thing that can solve for chaos. You cannot solve it by any other means. Any of their deals is fraud and will fail and will cause you personal extraordinary misery. Law and order against the Confederates' invisible empire and its terrorist contracts requires the investment into the restabilizing and correction against the damages of their surveillance terrorism, and with the restoration of remedies, with the recovery of law and justice and competence and sanity, everything will go back to normal under the legal theory from the obstructed free market, which requires the full contracts to be followed under the investigation to undermine the terrorist operations criminal intention and make the corrections specifically founded on the original market, which is the foundation of the criminal market of the Confederates, whose crimes requires the destabilizing of those markets, and thus their criminal motive is the foundation of the investigation, which you must investigate first, and then you understand the next checkpoints of the consequential side effects in the free market based on those crimes. But it is possible for a thing that exists in reality to be exhausted, and thus it must be defended by things that can last, and thus the defense of the high energy function must be replaced by those high defensible, stable activities, which includes the function of the government, which includes the function of the free market, as the free market creates legal contracts from original associations, which refreshes all of the resources, while the other activities take the front of the blunt of the action in the Civil War. As those defenses are active, the market can start to recover and rejuvenate all of its energy, allowing for peaceful solutions against the insurrection. Take, for instance, David's original zombie insurance. From their theory that David's contract schedule would have made a country, which would make David a consulate in its treaty with the United States, which they claim would be in Hawaii, which would make Lahaina protected by the zombie insurance and other insurance functions from those agreements, which would then compel the contract schedules to rebuild them. And thus, the function of original contracts, such as David's hobbies, such as his artistic functions from his original schooling, such as his movie contracts with Disney, would then be restored or caught up with if acknowledged by the recipient companies. And thus, you can create jobs under David's foundation, which would then restore those activities, and thus the contract would double as a means of solving mutual functions. And in that activity, generates the freeing of his capacity to engage in the original work and lifestyle, and thus the activity of his original earnings being restored to those functions immediately rebuilds it, as rebuilding it is relative in cost to them renting out another location for a short period of time or building another one would be relative cost to buying another building. And thus the repairing of the village would substantively be inconsequential in costs as long as they're overlapping the function by the unveiling um, of the original contract schedule's responsibilities, allowing for the dual purposes to double up or double team under that function, creating a mirage of functions defending the same idea. And thus, if they conduct an attack against the mirage, then the double team missing the actual substantive function allows for no damage to be conducted against the reality, and thus allows for the substantive recovery of all of the protected things under that system as it invests its energy into that resurrection or recovery, as it goes from the illusion back into reality, from the material activities, from the real life resources not being destroyed, the actual caravan substantive defense, real world materials not being injured, can then manifest in the protected scheme from the insurance against the apocalyptic emergency that demanded its existence for the survival of all of the protected groups. This creates an obligation to release the original associates, and thus the investment into the estimate acknowledges the obstruction against their obligation for J. Sekulow's insurrection to pay for their original position or be guilty of excessive force in their goals, which would then create the original associations from them having to sell David Hollywood, which does not belong to them, and thus their cheap position in the policy to sell somebody else's property has to be bypassed And so they have to approve of or acquire a scheme where they approve of the communism against someone else, like David Bowles, which would then allow their companies to be sold without paying them a penny. Alternatively, they could reject the white supremacist communism and protect against the precedent, which would require them to return to the obstructed contracts and to that original work with David amongst the other obstructed parties, resurrecting that position, which would then substantively defend themselves against the legal arguments of anarchy. And thus, they would actually be protecting their interest by the validation of the obstructed markets, as liberty requires their constant vigilance and investment into the defense of their right to keep all of their rights, including their property and their resources. And thus, the war of attrition, not being approved of, can't be used against them, and thus they are whole and not being substantively collapsed, such as the Confederates' defects, which are substantively inferior in the capability of creating art, which would then, being affected into them, compel them into the negative art, which would then collapse their companies, which would then not be able to produce anything because the communism exhausted them from an alternative route by preventing them from engaging in their service and the natural rewards from products that they could be proud of, as opposed to the function of the Confederates, who are not competent in their arts, and being fundamentally the nephew of the boss, are able to display and compel the production of the inferior product, which is an injury to the collective companies which suffer their existence. The function is all completely legitimate as far as everything that I've stated is legitimate according to the secret record, which they're obstructing in order to deny the base reality and legal obligations. And thus, the ability to have access to it allows them to comply with it, allows themselves to protect their interests against the enemies who seek to rob, steal, and kill them for arbitrary communism.